So welcome to the In Conversation Thinkers50 broadcast in celebration of International Women's Day. So Ruth, I don't know how you're feeling about doing this. I've got a touch of nerves in my stomach, but I'm also very hopeful about this session and maybe the impact it can have. And I guess I'm feeling just very trusting really in the process, but also trusting in us, because whenever we seem to get together, we have great conversations. So I don't know how you're feeling about doing this.
Well, I'm also feeling nervous. And I think it's because normally when I agree to do something, speaking on a panel, doing an event, it's always very clear to me what the purpose is and what are the messages and I want to get across and the impact that I want to have. But this is a conversation, so it's much more open-ended wherever we take it, which feels more challenging in a way, but also I'm sure that we've both decided to do this because we feel that there are some messages about leadership and change and challenge that we really feel it's important to get out there, because that's so much what all of our interactions with each other have been about.
They certainly have. I don't know why you, when you said yes to my invitation to join me to do this, I guess why I said yes to Thinkers50 was I like personal stretch and challenge, and I felt this could be that. It's a chance to perhaps influence thinking about how to lead change, which is really going to be the theme of what we mean by choose to challenge. And I also think, Ruth, for you and I, it's a chance for us to cement our relationship. Not that it needed cementing, but, after 20 years of knowing each other, it's a good chance to explore the subject matter together. But you might want to say why you've agreed to choose to challenge this session.
I think that as may come out in the conversation, because I find it hard to say no to you. And you come up with ideas of things which feel challenging and nerve-wracking, but generally feel very good after the event. So that's what I'm hoping for on this.
Okay.
So I guess we probably ought to introduce ourselves, say who we are. So maybe shall I go first? So
go for it, Ruth.
I'm Ruth Cairnie. I'm currently the chair of Babcock International, the defence group. I'm the senior independent director at Associated British Foods. And for the last 7 years, I've had a portfolio of different non-executive roles, both on corporate boards and not-for-profit. Before that, I had a long career in Shell, which was where we met each other. But really, perhaps what's more interesting is that the journey of my career has been from a starting point of being a research physicist, and not just a research physicist, a research theoretical physicist. So I have been on an enormous learning curve of understanding about commerce, about managing risk, about strategy, all different aspects of business. And then more and more importantly, understanding organizations and people and the different ways of really ensuring that organizations are completely behind whatever it is you're trying to achieve, because the best strategy is nothing unless the organization has the capability and the motivation and ability to deliver it. So it's been a very, very fruitful journey for me. And with that, an awful lot of challenge and choosing.
Well, we can probably unbundle what the choosing and the challenging has all been about for us. Yes, so thank you, Ruth. So I'm Deborah Rowland, and I guess I've chosen certainly my professional life anyway, to really focus on the subject of change and its leadership. So I'm very loyal to that subject. I've worked in industries from oil, Shell, where you and I met, Ruth, to fashion, to media, to fizzy soft drinks. And in a way, I have this passion to help organizations, to help leaders go through change in more effortless ways. And for those of you who maybe know me or my writing, I started my last book that my life began in change. So I'm an adopted child, and I think something about me is how have I used my story of adoption and then tracing my birth parents. And that was certainly choosing to challenge the secrecy of Ireland and mothers and babies' homes. So that's been a big influence in my life. I studied anthropology. So I studied not the physical world, Ruth, but the world of human interaction and all of its wonderful diversity. And I do feel anthropology has given me such a curiosity, really, about human systems and how they function and how they evolve. So that brought me to the field of change. And I'm here in Cornwall. This is my cottage in Cornwall, where I've spent most of my lockdown. And yeah, I'm also quite an introvert. So I think being in Cornwall in a very tiny cottage has, in all of this crisis, been great for me. But anyway, what's our intention, Ruth? I think our intention is to move to choose to challenge. I mean, that's the theme of International Women's Day this year. So I guess
wasn't it the case that I think one of the things that drew us to say yes to doing this was actually that was such a great title. It just resonated with both of us.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, except for my slight mistake, because I I remembered it as being courage to challenge and went away and started thinking about it, and only then realized it was actually choose to challenge, which I guess the learning is read the brief carefully. But actually it's the same thing, I think, because being passionate about leading change, that has to have challenge, and you have to make the choice to challenge and what to challenge and how to challenge, and often that takes courage, so it all comes together.
Yeah, it all bundles together.
So sorry. So I think we thought that it was quite interesting, hadn't we, to sort of separate out and think about choice and challenge and what each of them mean, and talk a bit about them for each of us individually, but also a bit about what we've done together, which has had a strong flavour of that as well. And we also thought, because this is recorded for International Women's Day, we would make sure that we did bring through the theme of women's development and gender equality and diversity. Probably a mixture, because it's there implicit, because we are both women. We've both gone through our careers and made our career choices. We're both of an age where we've done quite a lot of things that were quite pioneering. So the women's agenda has been part of our careers, I think, but also we'll get to it explicitly a bit and talk about how all of these thoughts about change apply to making progress on women's issues and equality for women.
Yeah, absolutely.
So should we start with well, you've talked a bit about choice, I think, but do you want to say more about what are the big things that choice means for you?
Yeah, what does choice mean for me? I mean, you can choose how to act, you can choose, what to do in the world. You've mentioned career choices as well. But for me, the subject of choice is all about, in a way, choosing how to be and choosing yourself. Because to challenge well, it has to come from the quality of your inner state, how you are as a leader. And I always loved, I think, the oft-quoted Viktor Frankl quote, which is, between every stimulus and response, we have choice. So it doesn't matter what experience gets thrown in life, and we can't control everything in our lives, we can always choose how to respond to what happens. So for me, choice is all about, how do you choose how to show up? So just as you said, stories about that. So I've spoken about my adoption, but choosing yourself, we're always choosing ourselves all the time. And ourselves might be influenced by the situation we're in. Do I need to show up like this in this culture, or do I need to show up like that? But I think the really important thing here is to choose your true self. Who is your true self? So for me, it wasn't really until I'd encountered my adoption story and traced my biological mother and father, which was, going back to courage, it was a bit of a scary thing to do. You might remember it at the time, Ruth. You and I were
very well
at the time. And when I chose to do that, what it gave me, I sense, was this enormous sense of what I would call detached curiosity. As an adopted child, my essence is a bit of detachment, really. A bit of a fear of belonging, but also huge curiosity. And I find it's very important as a leader to really know what your essence is. And I chose to use my adoption as an asset rather than something that could actually pull me back. So choosing yourself. How do you know who you are? Who do you know who you are? I think that's really important to figure out. The second aspect of choice for me is choosing the quality of your inner state. And I've been fascinated in the field of change with this whole notion in neuroscience that we cannot be both anxious and curious at the same time. So our brains are neurochemically wired to either have the right prefrontal cortex fired up, which is anxiety, or the left prefrontal cortex, which is to be curious about what happens. And it's a wafer thin choice between either being scared or frightened, or what, shall I say that or not? Because if I say that, what will people think of me? Or to be curious, well, I'm just going to have a go. I'm just going to have a go. So choosing to be curious all the time, as opposed to maybe acting out of insecurity or fear, seems to me a really important facet. And I remember the very first time when I consciously was aware of choosing the quality of my inner state. And it was when we were together at Shell, I think, Ruth. We weren't together at this. I was doing a workshop in Brazil. And it was a change management program that I was running. And I remember the group, there was about 20 leaders in the room, were just getting a bit sort of sticky with the issues and seemed not able to break through in their learning process. And the head of change for that operating unit seemed to be quite reluctant to go to new places. And I remember physically, I uncrossed my legs and I took in a deep breath and I thought, I can either choose to defend the program now and get a bit anxious. Oh my goodness, will I be on the second plane home now? Or can I choose to be curious about what's going on in the room and to inquire? Do we choose to inquire? So I chose to be curious and I made an intervention. I'll never, ever forget. It was 1999. And from that moment on, my challenge landed in such a beautiful way. And I remember consciously choosing my inner state. And from that moment on, it's like a light switched inside me that I think, aha, the quality of one's inner state really governs the quality of your challenge. But anyway, I don't know for you, what does choice mean? But for me, it's all about choosing the inside of you.
Just let me ask. So that sounds like a really big choice that you made at that moment. Was it scary? Was it something that you hummed and hawed about, or was it just something that suddenly felt right?
It was number one and number three. It felt right and it was scary. Right. And you know me, Ruth, I always say that if something feels scary, it's right. So if you're sitting on the edge of thinking this is going to be very scary, that's probably exactly the right thing, therefore you need to do. Because if you're leading change, if you don't have what I call the eek factor, you're probably stuck in old routines rather than trying to challenge things and go to different places. Yes, it was scary. I'll be honest with you. Yeah. But I don't know about you, whether you've been on your edge at all. I
think the eek factor, as you've just called it, is clearly what you've taught me. So I was thinking about choice, and for me, I think it does start with the career choices that I've made. And I think, as coming back to that trajectory that I've been on, from being the scientist to being the business person to being the leader of organizations, I think initially in my career, I used to follow routes that were going to give me even more interesting things to do, intellectually stimulating, bigger problems to solve. But then more and more, I started to follow the path of roles that would give me the opportunity to have bigger impact, to organizations that really had big problems where they were going to be people issues and cultural issues that really needed to be addressed in order to transform and get much better performance. And it struck me that what's driven me to do that and make all those choices and keep looking for those eek factors. And I think we talk more and more now about how companies must have a purpose. For companies, it's not just about generating profit. They must have some clear purpose about what value they're going to create for society and for all stakeholders. And I think more and more that, for most people, there's a big element of that as well as individuals. And I know that I've got this really strong drive to be an influence for good, to do whatever I can to drive good outcomes. And that's really driven those set of choices that I've made. And my in a business sense, actually, I would start with something that is probably quite similar to your situation in Brazil, but not quite so in the moment. And it was actually the time that we started first working in anger together, Deborah. So it was in Shell, and I had just been appointed to lead a newly formed global business, which was pulling together the commercial fuels business from each country around the world. So it was about 60 countries. The business it looked different in every single country. So whether it was the operating model, the target customers, the offerings we made, it was very unclear how profitable this business was really, and also what the drivers of profit were. So there was a big opportunity, but also, an awful lot to do to just get started on that. And I had the opportunity not only to design the organization for this newly formed business, but also to choose my leadership team, the group that would set the agenda and run the business. And I remember looking ahead to my first meeting of that leadership team. They'd all been appointed. And normally my normal behavior, and actually the normal behavior of, I think, every leader I had worked with, would have been to get the team together, talk about the business, the customers, the costs, the numbers, the levers we could pull, the financial ambition, and that would be it, sort of pulling together a strategy very much focused on numbers and business. And I consciously decided, with that team coming together for the first time, to spend most of our first session talking about us. So talking about who we were, a bit about our backgrounds, why we had chosen to accept those roles and come into that team, what we were hoping for from this business, what our fears were, how we wanted to show up. And we left that meeting with this really strong sense of who we were and what we were going to stand for, including a quite deliberate choice about how we wanted to lead the organization and lead the transformation of the organization. And I remember after that how powerful it was, because when things were going wrong and we were hitting obstacles, we could always come back to that initial conversation and say, are we living up to what we wanted to do, or do we need to reset? So that was a really unusual, uncomfortable choice that I made. And you were very much involved in encouraging me to do that, as I recall.
I do. I remember that meeting. I think we were in Singapore. Sorry. I remember the hotel room even, and the swirly carpet, on the floor. And I think all of your team were around you. And I introduced some frameworks that I work with in change, the different choice of change approach, how to go about change, and maybe not doing it so much in the traditional way. And I'll never forget going through the choices of change approach. And I could see your team sort of going, oh dear, that would feel a bit different here. And shall we tend to, do it like that? And I remember that fateful choice, when the choice to be less top down and programmatic, and to really open up the organization to actually accept a bit of chaos and messiness, because you were trying to do big, bold things in the business that required such different leadership paradigm. So if you then brought in the change process in a traditional way, it's kind of, the process and where you were trying to head wouldn't have been congruent. But we really challenged them. I don't know if you remember, because there was some people saying, well, no, I think it'd be better to do, our staff would expect it to be like this. And then one of the very, very brave people said, well, actually, no, I think we need to do it like this. But I'll never forget, I think they went out to create pictures of the story, speed, spirit, and stretch.
Yeah.
It's never been done before, had it?
Well, I think, yeah. So I think what was this whole piece that you brought in about how we should go about change, for me, the key thing was that this business was in 60 countries, fairly small teams in each country. And that however much we as a global leadership team said, this is the change we want, that in that organization, absolutely nothing would change unless the local teams really wanted it to change, and they did it. So they would have to understand what was new and different. They would have to have confidence in it. They would have to like it, and they would have to feel that they could make it happen. And so just sending out instructions was just never going to cut it at all. And I remember that I mean, I was really pleased with that first meeting and how the team kind of embraced, yes, we're going to go for emergent change and we're going to do it this way.
A little weird, but let's go for it.
Yeah. And with a lot of trust of each other, that we were going to sort of hold hands and do it together. And then I remember that notwithstanding that, we then started to plan our first extended leadership team meeting. And I think that was going to be 110 people or so. And so we started to pull together, two or three of the team said, we're going to work on our compelling narrative. And, another couple were helping with the design of the whole workshop with the extended team. And the compelling narrative finished up being 5 slides or something, saying, this is the big change we're going to have. And we decided that it would be a good idea to test this and to go and trial it with a couple of groups of people. And the very, very worrying news was that it fell completely flat. And the feedback was, it's same old, boring, just what we expect, management speak. We don't think anything is actually going to change if this is how you're putting it across. And then I think we were pretty much into crisis mode, because it was only a short time before this big meeting and everyone was going to be flying in. And we had to have something to say. And I think you and I finished up saying, do you think we could tell this in pictures? And that led to the formulation of these 3 pictures, speed, spirit, and stretch, which were going to tell our story. And we had a meeting with the leadership team and went through it. And there were some pretty stunned faces. But we were saying, should we go and trial this version of our story? And then, do you remember the wonderful Petra? She cut in and she said, well, actually, I don't see what we've got to lose. Because something. And so she went and trialed it with a group from her part of the organization. And we got all this feedback about how incredibly engaged the people were, and they were starting to draw changes on the pictures and put in new bits because there was something in their part of the environment that was a bit different. And we realized, and I think all of us gradually realized, that this was so powerful because it was letting everybody in the organization express their views in the business in the form of this picture. Yeah.
It was, I think, extremely challenging for your leaders, though, to that. So I think the thing I admire about your leadership, Ruth, is that choosing to challenge is partly about your personal leadership. But what I see you doing and what I see other leaders doing, what I've tried to do, is it also has to be about giving permission for the whole system to choose to challenge. You can role model it yourself, but in a way, can you put in processes that in themselves are quite challenging? So it's not just a personal thing. As you say, you like to impact big, large, complex systems. So there has to be sort of processes that are allowing people to choose to challenge, and they could challenge the pictures. It'd never been done before. So it was just really wonderful.
Yeah, so everybody could challenge and say what they liked and what they didn't like.
Exactly. So maybe this whole subject of challenge, we've looked at choice, you, Ruth, it was career choices, but also choosing your purpose, is what I heard you say. I talked about choosing the quality of your inner states is really important as a precursor to being able to challenge effectively. Certainly, the research we've done at Still Moving is one of our phrases is make disturbance your friend. You can't do change leadership unless you can get really friendly with being disturbed yourself and disturbing the system around you. And there's this leadership skill called edge and tension, the capacity to essentially name truth. What's here? What are we doing here, right now? And as you know, though, if that alone is not great, because if all you do is name what's here and you don't do it without a sense of the intention of the group, what are we trying to achieve here? You have containment, which is like, I guess Amy Edmondson would call that psychological safety. So you're calm and assured yourself, and you give permission for people to go to different places, and you have to do it in the moment. So many people choose to challenge after the event, and then they might send it on an email afterwards, and you've lost the chance, haven't you? So this thing about how do you make disturbance your friend as a change leader, it's partly about straight talking, but there's a lot more than that. It's quite a difficult thing to get right.
Yeah, and I think I've talked about my career story. I mean, it's an ongoing story, sometimes getting it right, sometimes not quite, but understanding the power of those sort of interventions is really important, I think, and then trying to hone the skills. And when I think of what challenge means for me, I guess in reality, a lot of the times when I'm questioning, probing, challenging, it is going to be about, different aspects of strategy or different management of risk, new opportunities, financial performance. So it is going to be very much about what the organization is doing and what it's delivering. But I think, very often I've seen that the most powerful areas of probing and challenging are about how the organization is doing things. And thinking about that, what comes vividly to my mind is an occasion when I was on the leadership team of a big global organization. And we had spent quite a while, months, focused on the need for the organization to change behaviors. And it was lots of really competent people doing very good technical roles, but they weren't standing up and being accountable and sort of holding their line in the way that we felt they needed to. So we wanted people to behave differently. But I remember several times with this leadership team listening to this conversation and thinking, the trouble is we're talking about this change in the abstract, and it's as if we want them below us to change. And I started thinking, but if they at the level below us are thinking about what the level below them need to do, then eventually all the expectations of change in this whole organization are cascading to the poor people at the bottom. And that's just never going to work. And I kept on, but obviously not very effectively, because we seemed to be going around this same pattern. And then we were once again about to have an extended leadership team meeting with 100 or so people. And I remember the consultants who'd been brought in to design the meeting. I'd had several discussions with them, and I had expressed my frustrations and views that this was so important that we changed the approach and the ownership of the change. And they felt, I think, that the framing for at the beginning of this meeting was not going to get to that. So they asked me if I would come and do 5 minutes just to express these views. And I, once again, rashly said yes, and then thought, oh, goodness.
Bit of an eek factor there.
And the more I thought about it, I got this really strong, clear picture of what I wanted to say. And but it was going to be really quite stark. It was going to be challenging to the top leaders, the most senior people in the room. And it was going to be very different from the way that people would normally talk at a meeting like this. And so I had a quite sleepless night. I mean, you talked about anxiety. I did have a bit of anxiety beforehand. But in the morning, I took a deep breath and I told my story of what I thought I'd seen going on, which was all about how, as a leadership team, it was as if, with the metaphor, that we'd identified that we needed to get really fit. And so we'd all spent a fortune on fantastic sports gear, and we'd paid membership to the gym, and we'd done lots of research on the best exercise programs. And we spent lots of time in the gym discussing the equipment and how much good it would do us, but none of us actually got on any of the machines. And I remember, as I was saying this, the absolute attention of everyone in the room. And then over the rest of that meeting, I think it was a day and a half, how several times people came back to that analogy. So it had provided a really strong framing. And it made people feel uncomfortable if they were going about things the normal way. But it was a choice to do that. And that one, I think, was a challenge that worked well. But knowing how far you can go and what's the right way, I know you are very expert at this.
Well, I wouldn't say expert. But yeah, in fact, they reminded me of a story recently, Ruth, about, again, it was an extended leadership meeting. I was working with a client organization, and the whole essence of the change was about more empowered decision-making and less emphasis on hierarchy, because their marketplace was changing really rapidly. And I was asked to do a keynote at their conference about leading change, sort of supposedly as an expert in the subject. I'll never forget going up onto the stage, and people were just mingling, and they're about to come in. By the way, everything was in rows. So it was kind of like and it's very, very dark at the back, and you could hide and not be seen. And I saw that in the front row, on each of the empty seats, was a big piece of paper which said VIP. I know. So they put these VIP things on the front row, and I was about to get up to talk at a conference about how they were trying to reduce the hierarchy. And I remember, Ruth, getting up onto the stage thinking, should I say anything about this? Going back to choice points. And I thought, why not? I am here as a change agent. So, and I remember I've made, but again, the choice was the 5 seconds I walked up onto the stage. Will I say anything or not here to do this challenge? But I did. But I guess I know we're going to get onto the women's subject now, and how you've certainly chosen to challenge various institutions. But I think what I've brought, hopefully, to the field of change is I chose to challenge the traditional way of doing change. I remember back in 1999 reading an amazing book called Emergence by Stephen Johnson that really got my light bulbs thinking, oh my goodness, if only we could run our institutions a bit more like complex adaptive systems, or the living world that knows very well how to adapt and innovate. Couldn't we accelerate change in organizations? And it was very counter-cultural at the time, where you had big programs, lots of teams were set up, and it was all very orchestrated. You had the head of transformation and big central change teams. And it was very, very different. And I remember one organization I worked with over a period of 3 years, they thought I had gone crazy. They thought the CEO were bonkers. And in fact, I was even talked about in the national press of this country. Why on earth is this crazy woman coming in from the outside and, sort of shaking up one of our precious national institutions? But not only what I was doing, but how I was doing it was seen to be completely mad. The result of it, though, Ruth, was that they had the fastest ever IPO in that nation's history as a consequence, because the challenging way of going about their business opened them to new possibilities. But yeah, I'm quite pleased in a way that I think my writing and talking and practice in the field of change has certainly challenged the traditional linear thinking behind how to lead change effectively. So, yeah, after 3 decades in the field, I maybe know a few things, but I'm still learning. Still learning.
And I think what you've done, because the fact that you actually did the research, so you've got evidence.
Yes.
So because I think for many people it is very counterintuitive to take the emergent approach, because you're letting go of control and thereby getting control in a bizarre way.
Yes.
And the fact that it's all backed up with research, I think, makes it much easier. I mean, that was very much the conversation I had back with that commercial fuels leadership team, wasn't it? Are we prepared to embrace a very different approach to change?
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Ruth, because I think it helps to challenge when you have some kind of credibility, or there's some data or statistics behind it. So then it's not seen to be a personal agenda. I think too often I can see people choosing to challenge, and it's all about a personal hobby horse rather than maybe something that is well validated. So that does help other people hear your challenge in a different way. It's about how do you prepare the audience when you're challenging them. So Ruth, I mean, one of the reasons, why I wanted to invite you to come into this conversation is to let's now move to the women's subject. And out of all of the female leaders I know, I mean, for me, hats off to you in terms of how you've not just been a personal example of choosing to challenge orthodoxy, but I know that particularly in the defence industry or in the STEM subjects, you've done so much work now to further the cause of women. So I don't know whether you'd like to talk a bit about that
yes.
and companies you see getting this right, or maybe where they don't get it right. So, yeah, share about that.
I suppose if I think so, as I said in the introduction, in a way, gender diversity has always been a thing for me, because every step of my career has been something about gender diversity and progression of women, because a lot of the things I've done, it was the first woman to have this role, the first woman to do that, just because that was the way it was. But I think it was just looking back at how this has all developed in the 90s. I was asked, so the first time I looked at the topic from an organizational point of view was when I was asked to lead a review of diversity, not just gender, but all the different nationalities as well, in Shell's eastern region, so sort of everything east of Suez almost. Mm-hmm. And we did a lot of research and analysis and pulled together a business case and some steps that we should take. But I remember that then, and for many, several years, certainly, I think probably many years afterwards, it was really all about the business case. And were people really convinced that taking action and getting more women into organizations and more women into senior roles in particular, why? Is it the right thing to do? Does it really make sense? And, so my glass half full view is that, if I think about how this topic is addressed now, I think there's much less discussion about should we worry about not having many women in senior roles, or other kinds of diversity as well. And I think that for many people, the business case is established. And I tend to think I spend much less of my time worrying now about organizations and leaders for whom that's not the case. Because I think if they don't believe it and if they don't get it, it will become existential for them. Because in due course, people will not choose to go and work for organizations that are sort of old-fashioned, very monolithic. People are choosing to go to much more open, inclusive organizations where everyone can be themselves. So I worry much more about the leaders and the organizations who do really want to change, but maybe are struggling to translate their actions into real outcomes and progress. So I think what I see not working, and I see really quite a lot of organizations who are trapped in this, is where I think there's genuine commitment from the top of the organization, but it's then passed maybe to be the responsibility of the HR function and the D&I experts. And they are trying very, very hard to make a difference, but without the absolute ownership of the line. And in those organizations, you often see, and I've heard senior leaders say this and be very frustrated, there's so much activity, so many initiatives, being busy on this topic, and yet nothing about the numbers or the behavior or the attitudes are really shifting. And so that's the sort of what doesn't work. And I think where I've seen much more progress, and I see this with my Powerful Women hat, which is all about the energy sector. I see it as patron of the Women in Defence Charter, where you see organizations where the senior leaders and the top leader just totally passionately believes that things have to change. And they always talk about it. They always intervene if they see behaviors and actions and things that are not aligned with the direction they're going in. They will set very clear expectations of their organization and their team and hold people to account. And they just drive things with a powerful conviction. And then you get real change. The best example I know, by the way, was, Andrew Mackenzie, who was until recently the CEO of BHP, the mining company, who in 2015 said, we are aiming to be gender balanced in a mining company.
Yes, gosh, that's absolute compelling. That's choosing to challenge.
Yeah, and with an absolute compelling case about why that must be the case. Because of the performance they'd seen, the much better performance they'd seen on their operating mining sites where there was more diversity in the leadership team, and then real steps being taken. So to my mind, it comes back to leadership. And a lot of those things that I said, those really effective leaders do. It's just the same if you want to change safety culture.
Yes, I was thinking of safety when
you talk, live
Mm.
it. And if you ever walk past something that's unsafe, you've sent the huge message to your organization about how important safety is really. I think it's exactly the same on inclusion and diversity. You need to intervene and demonstrate that you expect things to change.
Yeah.
And what about you? Because you have lived all of this as well.
I have. I think I'll summarize what you've said. It's very interesting what you said, Ruth. I think about leadership gets movement, whereas programs get action. The real difference, isn't there? Because it's still moving, we separate out what is action and what is movement. And movement is always driven when the assumptions are shifted and when leaders can model it. I guess my big story here was when I was working at PepsiCo, and Indra Nooyi, was made. I think she was head of strategy then, not she was then, became CEO. But I remember all of the stats and the analytical bits of diversity were out there, and it really wasn't. It was the department was running all of the stats, and people were getting a bit anxious, but nobody was doing anything. But I'll never forget there was a conference when people got to the stage and told stories, really powerful personal stories about why they're in a meeting, if they'd been overlooked. And again, this wasn't just about gender; it was about all issues around diversity. But I think then I really learned the importance of compelling stories and narrative as a way to really help influence change. Because, the stats get you at the intellect level, but when you hear powerful stories, it really gets you here and you think, my goodness, am I proud to be a leader in an organization if people are still feeling like that? So I think that when I've seen it being done really well, raising issues of women or other diversity, I think appealing to the right brain and using narrative is as important, if not more important than all of the stats. But going back to stats, as you've mentioned the research I've done, Ruth, and I remember you were in my original study about 15, 18 years ago. And I think we got about around 200 leaders. We interviewed them and did variance analysis between certain kinds of leadership behavior and successful change outcomes. And in the top 5 percentile in our study, which I think was about 18 leaders, I think about 12 were women. Mm-hmm. In the total sample, which I think is about 2/3, right? In the total sample, I think there was only about a quarter. Now, we mentioned it in our research paper, but I don't want to say that women are better change leaders than men, but it was quite striking how in the top 5%, women were much more represented than the men. Hey.
It reminds me also just a short anecdote. So on the Powerful Women board, I've got one board member who is a sort of serial entrepreneur in the energy industry, very, very experienced businessman. And he says, Ruth, what you don't know and you can never know and never experience is the difference between a Powerful Women board discussion, which is a mixture of men and women, compared with a typical conversation of an all-male board in the energy sector, where there's a lot about ego and winning the argument and speaking, not listening. Whereas with our mixed group, it's all about listening and understanding and building on each other's views and challenging, but then converging to this is where we want to go. And I can't comment on that, but it's just really interesting that he says there is a real difference in how groups work when you've got a gender mix.
Excellent. That's a really good story there. Great, Ruth. Well, I think we've really gone through the whole landscape, haven't we, of our personal stories, maybe what we've seen work or not, and we've unbundled what it means to choose. And also, how do you do challenge in a quality way? I mean, obviously, it's really challenging times right now, isn't it? So I don't know if we can share any closing comments about, clearly with COVID now and the pandemic. Wow, we haven't really chosen to challenge. I mean, fate has given us this pandemic when we found that we were all out of control in a certain way. But any final lessons do you think we can share in terms of this subject matter? and how we move from a physical to a digital world. Because I think it's not going to go away. They said that COVID-19 has become the world's chief digital officer. Or how to convert into digital formats. But any stories you'd like to share here?
What I've experienced, and this is on all different kinds of organizations, is, for the first months of the pandemic, it was crisis mode. How do we manage the next week, the next short period, making sure people are safe, making sure finances are okay, whatever it was. And I think particularly this has been for non-executive people, so people who have that requirement. Your job is to stand back, think bigger picture if necessary. It's been really important to pick and make sure as soon as possible that challenge is coming in on. We can't just manage the crisis. We have to also think about where are we going in the future. And I think that for all organizations, the future is not going to be the same as it was before the pandemic. And there are going to be some things that have really shifted, like not going into the office every day. But for other organizations, it's really quite fundamental, because the past basics of the business might never come back. And if you miss the transformation that's needed, you're not going to be existent maybe in the future. You may also have missed enormous opportunities that have presented through learning how many things can be done digitally. And I mean, I've got experience. I know that you've done an awful lot of digital events. I've got experience of an organization where the business model has been about very, very special live events. And at the moment, we're going through very, very effective online events. But the question then, and the challenge that's needed is this a stopgap until we can get back to where we were, or is it a platform to build a future based on maybe a mix of online and face-to-face, but with a much bigger potential audience and, a whole new business that we could build? But that it's really difficult to, people are so tired and they're so busy with dealing with the day-to-day, but it's really important to challenge those very fundamentals, which I think for some businesses have changed.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a bit of a wake-up call, and can we see it as that, I guess? I found that by working online, I think my final comment would be, going back to the subject of choose to challenge, I've noticed online with leadership groups that more voices choose to challenge online than if they were physically in a room together. It's really noticeable. And we were processing it at a webinar last week, and that somehow, even though we're in our little screens, all of the screens are the same size. So the power hierarchy disappears online because we've all got a little rectangle. It's all the same size in a way. And people have said to me, because I'm in my sort of home environment and I haven't got tons of people around me, I just go for it online. I just obviously there's a shadow side, we know, with social media and trolling and everything. But a lot of leaders I've worked with said we can actually show up more authentically, and I can challenge far more effectively in the online world than perhaps if everybody's in a meeting room together, where all of the habits and assumptions and who sits where are very, very prevalent. So it releases people, as well as you're saying, it has a bigger reach. I also think it can release people psychologically to courage, going back to the word you used earlier.
Which says to me that there's just a sort of ongoing, this journey of new ways emerging of challenging and choosing to intervene in ways that make a difference.
Yes. And for me, I think the question is, are we conscious in how we do that and when we do that? So that's that for me. I mean, I think we said at the beginning, we don't have any answers here, but I think my thing that I really do know in my bones is that it all starts with yourself and how you choose to show up. And then that affects everything in terms of the quality of your own life, but also the lives of people around you, and how you can affect change. Any final comments from you, Ruth? Our intention here was to connect, choose to challenge with the field of change. Anything?
I think we've met the brief that we set ourselves. We both said when we thought about doing this that it's a bit like the listening project, which
Yes.
we both love. And I don't know if all the people on the listening project enjoy doing the conversations. I'm sure they do, but this has been great. And great to share to listen once again to all your wisdom about what great change really looks like.
Yes, and to see you putting it into practice. So thank you very much, Ruth, for joining this Thinkers 50 International Women's Day celebration.